Jon Schoonover is a native of Salem, Southern Illinois, 2 degrees from Carbondale, and then his 3rd degree at Auburn, and has now in his 17th year as a professor at, been a couple name changes here, the College of Agricultural Life and Physical Sciences at SIUC. He teaches courses in soils, watershed management, hydrology, aquatic resource management, tree identification, and new for this year, wood as raw material. His research has primarily focused on soil and water quality, hydrology, channel morphology, and sedimentation in ag and urban watersheds, and does best management practices, involves wascobs, streambank erosion, and cover crops. So Andrew at U of I and Jon at Southern are going to share the work that they do, that they're each doing related to streambank phosphorus. So, Andrew, if you want to go first, come on up.
I'm going first because our project is a statewide effort, and it's going to be about the overall concepts of streambank erosion. What is it? Why does it matter for phosphorus loads? And then we'll overview the approach that we'll be undertaking in the next 5 years in this project. I swear I do things besides phosphorus, by the way, folks. There's other nutrients that we work on in my group, but phosphorus for today. Okay, so this is a project funded by NREC, obviously, and it's got a team of hydrologists and remote sensing scientists, one who just spoke, Kai Guan. And we're doing this because, as you'll see, it's very difficult to get accurate and scalable matrices of streambank erosion rates. And specifically, we measured the recession rate, meaning how the bank is falling out as the river sweeps it away. And then we have to measure phosphorus in those soils to come up with a budget of streambank transferring phosphorus into these waters. So it's very challenging to do, but as you'll hear shortly, I think we have a way to do it. And of course, we thank Farm Bureau for helping us with access to sites, and U.S. Soybean Board has also funded us. We, again, leveraged this NREC to attract additional funds, $250K, to do some meta-analyses on how streambank erosion can influence water quality in general. And I'll talk about where that's relevant in just a second. So maybe first it's good to start with an overview of streambank erosion. A few things to keep in mind. The left-hand photos are from Polecat Creek. It's a tributary of the Embera in Coles County. And what you're seeing here is a typical example of pretty severe bank erosion. The top photo was taken with that black and white stick that's about 1.4, 1.2 meters long. So that bank is probably going on 8 foot tall, and it's being undercut. Streambank erosion is very punctuated. What I mean by that is that there's not a gradualism approach. It's not little by little every year, but rather there is a gradual eating away, undercutting of the bank. And then all of a sudden, there's a thing called mass failure where the bank collapses. So once every 10 years, there's an event where the entire bank falls in and you get a sudden and very large relative phosphorus loading via the soils being eroded. So the bottom figure shows you the concept of this. Note that we can be eroding soils that were themselves floodplains, like on the right-hand side. The point, though, is that we are eroding soil we are transferring phosphorus because of the soil eroded. Now, the right-hand image shows you a bird's eye view looking down on a meandering stream bank. And these are simply streams that are finding their way to the lowest point in the landscape. And in flat locations like our state, streams have to meander quite a bit to do that. So think of a snake slithering. It encompasses a pretty large area in its slither path. And in the same way, there's going to be slowing off of soil on the banks. So this is a natural process. Streams do this regardless of humans and regardless of ag by and large. Now, there's 3 things to take away here. One is what I just mentioned. There's a lot of hot moments where things are calm, and then there's a punctuated event where a lot, meaning most of the P loads, happens in a very short span of time. So measurements should be decadal timescales, and that's tricky to do. Second, we are loading sediment by eroding the stream bank into the stream. It's all falling into the water. And third, there's phosphorus naturally in soils, as we saw in the previous talk, that is then being carried into the stream. So we're mainlining this nutrient into our waters. And not we, but rather the streams themselves are doing this. So yes, if we fertilize soils, we'll have a little bit more total phosphorus in the topsoil, but by and large, this is the native phosphorus. So in some cases, the degree of bank erosion can be quite severe, like in this image. The fellow on the bottom there is about 6 foot tall, so that's a 25-foot bank being cut. And this is all largely loess parent material. So loess is what was blown in post-glaciation. Rich in phosphorus, we're talking 400 part per million phosphorus total concentrations. So the question arises for researchers and for those that have interest in water quality, how much can stream bank erosion contribute to total river P export? Is it significant? And part of what we're doing in the first phase of the project, being led by Dr. Zhou, is understanding globally what is known about this process with respect to P loading. And this is the result of the meta-analysis. These are published studies. There's some obvious gaps globally, nothing from Africa, South America, or really Russia or Asia. Most of the work has been done here in the US and in parts of northern Europe. And even then, though, these studies are pretty much a small handful. The US has the dominant number of studies at 60 of the world. In terms of how much the stream bank erosion contributes to the total P load of a stream, that is shown by the size of the circle. So that's the legend on the left. Bigger circle means a greater proportion. And as you can make out, in many parts of the US and in the north of Europe, it's appreciable. It's almost the 100% of the stream bank load. Within the Midwest, we zoomed in here. So the top number is the percent, and there's a range because it depends on the study and the time of year. But you're seeing the percent of the total stream load of phosphorus due to bank erosion. And the bottom number in parentheses, the very small one, that's the number of studies. So a few observations, very few studies, and the range is, well, quite variable. But it can be up to, in this case, 67%. So 2/3 in some contexts of these publications have found of total stream load can be from bank erosion alone. So this is not fertilizer loss, this is not erosion from fields, from tillage, this is from the banks of the stream. Okay, now this matters because if we have an appreciable amount of a stream which is draining a watershed, having its phosphorus loads from the banks, not from fertilizer, then that means that we might want to rethink the direction of resources for BMPs to mitigate P losses. So to me, this is about getting the right understanding, the right numbers on what is contributing to P loading. And so our state doesn't have any way of accounting for stream bank erosion. We have no real numbers on it. And this itself is acknowledged in the 2015 biannual report. And it points out that there's just a lack of data. And I'm going to walk through why it's so dang hard to get the right kind of data, time and space-wise, to answer the question of how much erosion is going on. Our neighboring state, as you heard about last year, did a recent assessment. The 18-year average of stream bank erosion's contributions to P loads from that state was almost 2/3. It was 31% of the state. That's a pretty big chunk. And so if that's not being distinguished, then it's going to be counted as an ag non-point source. So in my view, this could be thought of as a non-ag non-point source. Obviously, tile drainage is going to modify the hydrology of these landscapes, and that's what we're using the U.S. Soybean Board funds to do, is to understand how hydrology being modified by ditches and by tiles might be exacerbating, or sometimes not, stream bank erosion rates. And there's evidence that it can do both. So we have reason to think that our number might be bigger than that of Iowa, meaning a greater percent of our state P exports because of bank erosion. And that would be that we have a higher density of streams per cropland, about 1/3 higher density. Number two, we've got flatter ground than Iowa, so there's more of that meandering, and that's going to slow off stream banks over time. So this NREC then was funded to answer the overall objective, or the question of statewide and across the Huckate scale, what is the contribution going back to 1930 of stream bank erosion on P loads for our state? And that will give us the number that we need to better partition within the non-point sources, ag and non-ag, and then better understand or have expectations, let's say, on drawdowns. And I'll talk about why that matters later. We've got 4 sub-objectives, and shown here is the overall concept of how we're going to tackle this. But basically, the first is to understand the extent and the magnitude of past erosion and the P loads engendered by that. Then we'll quantify at very fine spatial and temporal scale. We're talking 6 months. At the stream level, the present erosion at a select site of Huck-8s across the state. Third, this will then give us the data to come up with a statewide estimate. We're going to scale up by modeling and remote sensing. And finally, to integrate those results into our state's strategy to decrease P losses. So we'll begin by picking 8 Huck-8s. And so these Huck-8s have been chosen to represent the diversity of what's called a major land resource area, MLRAs. Basically, it's a combination of climate, soil types, slope, land use, and these are shown as different colors on the map. So different colors is a different MLRA. And the idea is that if you have erosional rates and P being loaded by that erosion for a given MLRA, then you can scale out for that region and get a decent estimate. So we're going to pick 8 of these Huck-8s, and then within each of those, we're going to be focusing on, as you can see in the example of the Embera, different streams that vary in scale, and they're defined as different orders, from 1st to 4th to 6th order streams. And we'll select sites that are different scales, but also that are upstream of USGS gauges, so that we can link erosional rates to water quality data. So that's what we're going to be doing for both the historical assessment and for the present assessments of erosional rates. So for the historical, there's quite a bit of data out there. Some are from consulting companies that do work on river banks, so we've been able to access that with NREC funds. Also, mining data sets of images from planes and from satellites, and the plane ones go back to 1930s. There's some work to be done here to rectify those images. It's just a way of saying to process them. But we can go to 1930 with pretty good coverage. So that's 90 years of coverage. And because erosion happens all of a sudden over a 10-year scale, we need to go back at decadal time scales. Okay, and this is an example of why the observation of meandering afforded by this approach is useful. The image here shows you the Margenot River, and you can see how there's a migration of the channel over about a very long time period back to 1939. And the idea is that as that channel has moved, you can assume that the progressional movement is carrying with it the soil that would have been in that pathway. Now, we don't know what the fate of that soil is, whether it was deposited on the floodplain, a mile down the stream, 100 miles down the stream. Is it sediment tumbling down the channel? That we don't know. So this will give us an estimate of what is entering into waters, but not the same as what is leaving the state. That's a very difficult question to answer. Okay, and then present we'll look at, with erosion pins and drones, fine scale erosional rates. So erosion pins are shown here on the top right-hand side. As it sounds, you ram a piece of rebar about 4 foot long into the bank horizontally, and you measure the distance from the exposed soil. And you go back every 6 months, and the longer the distance from the soil surface, that's how much the recession rate is. So that's going to be an inch per 6 month or inch per year metric. So that's a coarse way of doing it. It's the standard, it's cheap, but it's not that accurate. It's not really that scalable. So for that, we will be using UAVs, drones, with LiDAR mounted on them to scan the banks. And LiDAR gives you very fine scale accuracy. So we can look at sub-inch changes, but in high detail across a stretch of a stream bank. And that's an example shown right here on the bottom right over a 2-year time period. We also then plan to look at soil phosphorus, because most assessments, including that of Iowa's, they assume a total p-value as an average across the state. I don't like averages. There's always distributions and ranges to get more accuracy. So we plan to, at all the sites that we put in pins and we monitor with drones, we plan to actually do soil profiling. I am a soil scientist, after all. And soil profiles on stream banks are really easy to do because the stream has done the work of cutting the hole for you. You can get in there and just look at it. So then by sampling these stream banks that are open face, we can quantify total phosphorus at each depth, and then the speciation. So speciation matters for stream bank erosion because there's different kinds of P that will be released as dissolved phosphorus in the water at different time scales. You might imagine that there's, say, the Bray or Melick P pool. When the stream bank collapses into the river, that all solubilizes. But then you've got things like calcium phosphates, like apatite, that's what bone is made out of. That won't dissolve for maybe years and maybe decades. So there's going to be different lags and slow release time courses of the phosphorus. So understanding the speciation can help us understand why, when there's a erosional event, don't we see a commensurate pulse in DRP downstream at the USGS gauge. And finally, we have as an objective to come up with a scalable tool. So our effort will take 5 years. We'll only do parts of 8 Huc-8s, and we can model to scale up. But we want to empower landowners and SWCDs to do this themselves. And one way to do this is smartphones. So the iPhone 13 Pro has a LiDAR camera on it. And there's a simple app that can be used to collect data points. And this is an example from Denmark where they have severe stream bank erosion, where there's someone using a smartphone on a selfie stick, and they can take pretty accurate scans as they walk of the stream bank. So this is a way to democratize the assessments of erosional rates across our state to get greater accuracy at fine scale to support SWCD plans. So the whole point of this is, of course, to give us a number on stream bank erosion. What is the contribution to our total P loads? And the short of this is that the red boxes on the bottom concept flow chart gives us the basis for calculating how much P is being loaded. So once we know across the state stream banks how much soil is being lost, what the P content is, then that can be multiplied out and give us a total number. That's the simple math. Getting to that math will take 4.5 years of lots of field work and going through these archived photos of satellites and planes. So with that, I should probably switch over to Jon, who's going to talk about an example in the south of Illinois of how they're going about stream bank erosion quantification. Thanks.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluating the stream bank phosphorus and sedimentation in these streams as well. I'm not quite going as big as what Andrew talked about. We're not trying to do the whole state. We're going to focus on 2 and look at them in some pretty good detail. I want to acknowledge Carl Williard, who kind of chose these watersheds and started some of the relationships with the Illinois State Water Survey, and that's who Elias and Laura Kiefer work with. And then Justin's the grad student. He's going to have a poster here in a few minutes. Amelia Vick and Jenny Snyder, they're my 2 door-to-door ladies that got landowner access. And then Jackie Krim runs a lot of samples in the lab for us. So what we're trying to do is quantify this in-stream erosion, including the stream bank erosion occurring in 2 streams in southern Illinois. And I'll talk about those in just a second. And then we're going to try to determine the proportion of the total phosphorus and sediment loads from each watershed that is due to this in-stream erosion. And then the Illinois State Water Survey is going to do the SWAP model and try to tie this in and look at some of the landscape transport mechanisms behind it. So we chose 2 streams. One of them is Lost Creek, if you know where Carlisle Lake is. This is just to the east side of Carlisle Lake. We're looking at 10 different cross sections in the watershed, and so we're trying to equally space them. It was a 20-mile reach. So every 2 miles, we're trying to find a landowner that will grant us access to the site to do a cross-sectional survey. The next stream is East Fork Shoal Creek. This is a little further north. This is between Hillsboro and Pana. It kind of wraps around the small town of Nokomis up there. So there's a little urban development in this particular watershed. You can see it in this slide here. So there is some urban development, and as you know, if you increase the amount of urban area or impervious surface in a watershed, you're going to increase stream flow and increase in-stream erosion as well. So the methods we're going to use, basically some of the same tools that Andrew was using. We're going to monitor it in these two watersheds using cross-sectional surveys. The surveys will allow us to look at deposition and erosion, so see what's accumulating in the channel, see how it's being redistributed across these different transects. And then we're going to look at erosion pin monitoring, which is that rebar, piece of rebar with the metal washer on it. We can measure how much bank is sloughed off. And then we're going to use a drone as well. We're not using LiDAR, but we are using just the RGB bands, using digital orthomosaic. So if you ever had a stereoscope, it's a tool we use in forestry some. You lay two pictures next to each other and look through the stereoscope, and then they become three-dimensional. Right, so we're overlapping a bunch of images to make a three-dimensional model, basically. So the timeline, in January of 2022, the rebar sites were selected, and I say rebar, we're not pouring concrete, these are the erosion pins. Then we tried to get this permission, and like I said, we've tried to, and I talked with Andrew about this yesterday, it's difficult to get landowner permission in a lot of these sites. We've tried calling, we tried sending a letter that looked very certified, but it ended up being, it's like you go door to door, and I sent my two female, I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not, but my two female researchers out there, they knocked on the door and they got permission. So it's like, you never know, you've all seen the memes of people at Walmart. We're basically dealing with the people of the cornfields. So they're very nice people, but you go in, a lot of them will welcome you in the house, other ones, you know, will say, there ain't no watershed around here. So anyhow, we got the rebar installed. We talked to these cross sections, got the landowner permissions, because there was 10 of those, so we're talking 26 sites that we had to get landowner permission from. So that took some time. And then we did some soil samples looking at the phosphorus and the bulk density of the soil so we could calculate some masses. And then we did some rebar readings just last month. They're hot off the press. Julie approached me and said, hey, let's do a talk on stream bank erosion. So what do? We go out and measure some erosion pins that we've had in the field for 7 months. And then we're going to do these readings every quarter, so every 3 months, and then annually we're going to go do the stream surveys. And then the drone flights we're also going to do annually. So like I said, the cross-section surveys, we're going to look at 10 transects in each watershed along a longitudinal gradient. So one of them will have every 2 miles, one of them we're going to do every mile, because it's only 10 meters. So we're going to survey a 6-meter reach where each point is referenced. We're using a total station, a TopCon total station that is very accurate down to the centimeter. So we're tying this in to benchmarks where we can go back and repeatedly measure those same sites over time. We're going to use Civil 3D and ArcGIS to create basically these three-dimensional maps that we can look at the grid and then we can overlay over time and see how that matches up so we can see where the erosion's happening and where the deposition's happening along that reach. The erosion pins, we're going to have 3 sites in each watershed, a lower, a mid, and an upper. So we're looking about every 3 miles or every 6 miles, depending on what stream it is. There's going to be 40 pins at each side on a 2 by 3 foot spacing. So like I said, there's the piece of rebar on the left picture, and it just has a welded fender washer on it, and you drive it into the stream bank. You can either do horizontal or perpendicular to the slope. Horizontal is going to measure more of the retreat. Perpendicular to the slope measures more of the erosion or loss. And then each pin is georeferenced, so we know exactly where each one is. We painted them orange so we can find them. And some of them get washed away. The drone data collection, like I said, we're going to use these orthomosaics to create the digital elevation models. The flight is at 25-meter height, so we're using a DJI Phantom 4 drone that's used for surveying, and it's a 25-meter flight with 80% overlap of pictures. So if you look at those blue dots, this drone's taking this flight path, and each photo is overlapped by 80%. So each pixel on the ground represents about 0.8 centimeters. So they're very detailed. That's an image from the drone on the right. So if you look at that 80% overlap I was talking about, each one of these green lines is tied to a picture. That's one point on the ground. So that's how many pictures of that single point was taken. So Usually shadows and shading and things like that get captured in one of the other pictures, and then those all get tied together or stitched together in that Pix4D software. So there's the digital ortho mosaic converted into a digital elevation model on the right. And here's we took a flight just last week just to go out and see what it looked like. And you can see there's some channel slough in there. This is not ran through the software yet, so we don't have any quantified number yet, but you can see that there is definitely movement, and it is able to be picked up on that drone. So, how many of you were here last year? I polled the audience and said, how many of you seen Talladega Nights? And I had like one Ricky Bobby fan in the audience. You know, he went nuts, but I appreciate that guy if you're here. But, so, Top Gun Maverick. Anybody seen that? Okay. As a forester, as a professor, this is as close as I'm going to get to an F-18 cockpit to fly. So this is the flight path that the drone will take, and we're just kind of taking you through the upper watershed and flying down to the lower part of the watershed. But we're just flying through the headwaters, and then we're going to take a turn and go down through the mid-reaches of this watershed. This is Lost Creek, and this is about a minute long. So you can see how far apart our cross-sectional surveys are. You can see here's the middle reach, and you're going to see some wasp cobs over here on the left. So there are some ag BMPs in this watershed. I've got a student that's going to have a couple of wasp cob projects over there. And then this is the lower reach. And this is where the Illinois State Water Survey sampling site, there's a bird strike or something there. So we just turn the corner, and you're going to see the bridge where their ISCO, their automated water sampler is, where they're collecting their data from. So that's what we're all going to connect it with here at the end. So some of the preliminary results, and this is from the erosion pin data. And like Andrew said, erosion pin data is not the best. You're not supposed to scale it up. I scaled it up. So that's all we had right now, so that's what we're doing. So if you look at these erosion pins, LSR1, if it has a 1, it's at the lower end of the watershed. 2's mid, 3's going up to the headwaters. So in this slide, you can see that there's a little bit more erosion in Lost Creek at the lower part of the watershed. East Fork Shoal Creek has more at the upper part of the watershed. So there's a little bit different scenario going on in these two watersheds. And you can see the erosion pins in the picture below, how much is exposed of that pin after a 7-month period. So here's just the example of scaling it up, which you shouldn't always do, but we're going to take more of these sites and we're taking more cross-sections, so all this stuff's going to be tied together. I promise if you give me 6 more months, we're going to have a year's worth of data and we're going to be good to go. But if we estimate the sediment loss from Lost Creek in the lower bank, in the lower reach, we had 706.3 pounds of sediment lost. If you take the height that we surveyed of the channel, take the length of that reach, the banks, exposed banks, are 14.7 acres. All right, that's not much. So if you scale that up, the sediment loss is about 4.8 million pounds. And the P loss in that for total phosphorus was 249 pounds per acre. If you look over to the right column, where the Illinois State Water Survey data is, they're only losing about 2 pounds an acre according to their data. All right? So that's what's being transported in the water versus what's coming off in the soil, in the stream bank itself. So total P loss, because we got to multiply by acres, you're only multiplying by 14.7 in our situation, so 3,600 pounds versus 48,000 pounds in theirs, because they're multiplying it by 24,000 acres, a lot more acreage. So if you take that ratio, we're losing about 7.6% of that phosphorus is being contributed from that lower reach of that stream channel. And like I said, the lower reach was the most erosive in this case, in this stream. But if we just tripled that for the other two reaches, we're looking at about 21% loss in phosphorus from the stream banks in that situation. So what happens to sediment in the stream? We got this thing called sediment delivery ratio. And for Lost Creek, it's about 0.27. That means about 27% of the sediment that comes off the watershed makes it to that outlet. They sample it. That's what they sampled. The rest of it might get caught in a wasp cob. It might be deposited on the landscape. It might be moving through the channel somewhere. So it could be deposited in any of those spots. So if we do all the math for that and take away our sediment delivery ratio for our bank that sloughed off, we're looking at about 12.1% of delivered sediment from the stream banks. Again, if you tripled that, and we shouldn't triple it because we don't want to scale it up, especially based on one site, it'd be about 36% of the sediment that came into that stream came from the stream bank. So the SWAP model, what the Illinois State Water Survey is going to work on, they're going to look at the sediment and nutrient transport in the surface and subsurface flows. So these are just maps showing land use, land cover, and the hydric soils or the soil types in the watershed. And then, so the summary of this, we lost about 0.6 inches of bank recession over a 7-month period in Lost Creek, and about 2.9 inches or 3 inches in Shoal Creek, East Fork of Shoal Creek. Stream banks in the lower reach of Lost, again, this is just the lower reach, was about 7.6% of the phosphorus and 12.1% of the sediment. So, like I said, we got a lot of work to do in the future. We've got everything out there. We've done our initial surveys. We've done our initial drone flights. We've got all the baseline data. We're just in kind of the holding position, waiting on things to happen. So we're waiting that year so we can go back out and collect the data. So this isn't rocket science, some of the recommendations for stream bank stabilization. If you look at that stream in the lower part of this slide, not a lot of cover along that channel, right? So if we could put any vegetation there, that would probably help a little bit. Slow down that water, because that's the two big things. You got water that's moving at a high energy, or you got a lot of water coming off at the same time. So the one thing we want to do in agriculture or in urban soils is kind of desynchronize that flow. So things like wasp cobs capture it. All the flow doesn't reach the stream at the same time. That's what's really, like this bank full discharge, what's happening in southern Illinois today, that's the channel forming discharge. Like Andrew mentioned, that's when you're going to get these big mass movements and a lot of sediment coming into the stream. So anything like grass waterways are going to slow it down. Cover crops, a big one. It's going to help infiltrate that water and make it come in through subsurface flows, not going to come in as overland flow. And then dry dams or wasp cobs. So obviously, NREC funding this project. I'd like to thank them. Illinois State Water Survey, a couple of these folks are in the crowd today, Aaron and Laura. They're the ones out collecting the data for the Illinois State Water Survey and kind of crunching the numbers and getting that data to us. And then the 20-plus landowners that we had to knock on their door and define a watershed for them. So that's all I got. I don't know time-wise where we're at, but I guess we both can take some questions.
Jon? Don has one.
Okay. I always say defer these to Justin. He's going to be here. He's prepping for his defense, but you can bring it.
Do we know how many miles of streams we have in Illinois?
Ooh, that's a good question. Perennial streams, there's probably a number. Ephemerals, that's the ones I think we really need to focus on. That's where a lot of the action's happening. Because like when we've always talked about this, and it's like, do you want to protect the bank of the Mississippi or all the hundreds of thousands of miles of these little ephemeral channels? And I don't think there's a number for that. Right, I mean.
You mentioned that for this rill or gully erosion that you showed, you said cover crop might be helpful. Do you think mulching is better for this option or cover crops? Because I believe cover crops cannot really hold the soil when the gully erosion is coming.
Yeah, either one would be helpful. It's just basically, like I said, to slow that water down. Anything that increases the roughness coefficient in the watershed to slow the water, I think is going to be helpful.
That's great.
So.